For 1,000 years, we thought we knew what a Viking was. Blonde hair, blue eyes, a horned helmet that, as it turns out, they never actually wore. A pure Scandinavian warrior, raiding from the fjords of Norway and Denmark, spreading fear and genetics across Europe through sheer ferocity, and a shared bloodline that bound them together as a single, coherent people. This image has been reinforced by centuries of romantic nationalism, by Hollywood films, by museum dioramas, and in recent decades, by extremist political movements that have appropriated Viking imagery as a symbol of racial purity. The word Viking, in the popular imagination, describes a race, a nation, a bloodline running unbroken through the centuries from the fjords of ancient Scandinavia to the present day. In 2020, the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted on the Viking Age was published in the journal Nature. It analyzed the genomes of 442 individuals from archaeological sites spanning the Viking world, from Scandinavia to Britain, from Russia to Greenland, from the 8th century through the 11th. The study, led by population geneticist Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen, drew on 6 years of collaborative research across multiple countries and institutions, sequencing ancient remains recovered from burial mounds, mass graves, shipwrecks, and isolated finds across the entire geographic reach of the Viking expansion. It was designed to settle questions that historians and archaeologists had argued over for generations. What it found instead was a wholesale demolition of the popular conception of who the Vikings actually were. The Vikings, the genetics revealed, were not a race. They were not even, in any genetically coherent sense, a single people. The word Viking does not describe an ethnicity. It describes an activity, a verb more than a noun, derived from Old Norse terminology associated with seaborne raiding and trading expeditions. Anyone could be a Viking in the sense that the term was originally used, and the genetic data shows that, in practice, many different kinds of people were. The study found that Scandinavia itself, the supposed homeland of Viking identity, was far more genetically diverse during the Viking Age than the modern stereotype suggests. Ancient Scandinavian genomes from this period carried significant genetic input from southern Europe and from populations associated with the eastern Baltic and beyond, reflecting centuries of trade, migration, and intermarriage that had been occurring long before the Viking Age formally began. The pure, isolated Scandinavian gene pool of popular imagination simply did not exist. Scandinavia in the 8th century was already a crossroads, not an isolated fortress of racial uniformity, shaped by contact with Roman traders, Baltic merchants, and migrating populations for centuries before the first longship ever set sail toward foreign shores. But the more striking finding concerned what happened outside Scandinavia, in the communities that history has labeled Viking settlements based on archaeological markers, burial customs, and material culture. Researchers analyzed skeletal remains from sites in Scotland's Orkney Islands that had been identified, based on grave goods and burial style, as belonging to Viking warriors, full sets of weaponry, brooches and jewelry styles unmistakably Norse in design, and burial postures consistent with Scandinavian funerary customs documented across the wider Viking world. The genetic results showed that 2 of the individuals buried with full Viking weaponry, in graves indistinguishable in style from those found across Scandinavia, were not genetically Scandinavian at all. They were genetically local, Picts or other indigenous populations of the British Isles who had adopted Viking culture, Viking burial customs, and quite possibly Viking identity itself, without carrying a drop of Scandinavian ancestry. This finding rewrites the entire framework through which Viking identity has traditionally been understood. For generations, archaeologists used burial style and grave goods as a proxy for ethnicity. A grave with a sword, a shield, and Norse-style jewelry was assumed to belong to a Scandinavian person, a methodology so deeply embedded in the field that entire population estimates for Viking-era migration and settlement were built on top of it. The genetics demonstrated that this assumption was, in a significant number of cases, simply false. Viking identity, it turns out, was something people could adopt. Local populations across the British Isles, the Baltic, and beyond were not always victims of Viking raids and subsequent colonization. In some documented cases, they were Vikings themselves, by every cultural and archaeological measure except ancestry. The implications extend further into one of the most quietly significant findings of the entire study. Researchers analyzed a famous Viking grave from Birka, a burial long assumed, based on its rich array of weapons, a complete set of gaming pieces suggesting strategic command, and 2 horses, to belong to a high-status male warrior, possibly even a military commander. The grave had been excavated in the 1880s and had served for well over a century as a textbook example of elite Viking male martial culture, reproduced in academic papers and museum displays as the archetype of Viking warrior burial. In 2017, ahead of the larger 2020 study, biological analysis of the skeletal remains had already revealed something the archaeological community had not anticipated. The individual buried in this elaborate warrior's grave was, biologically, a woman. The finding was deeply controversial when first published. Critics suggested contamination, mixed burials, or misidentification of remains. But subsequent genetic confirmation, incorporated into the broader 2020 study's analysis, supported the original finding. A woman had been buried with the complete material culture of an elite Viking warrior commander, weapons, strategic gaming equipment associated with battlefield tactics, and the trappings of military authority. Whether she had actually fought in battles, commanded warriors, or simply held a position of authority that warranted this burial remains a matter of interpretation. But the genetic evidence eliminated the possibility that this was simply a case of mistaken identification. The grave belonged to a woman, buried with the full ceremonial weight of Viking martial authority. This single finding complicates a foundational assumption about Viking society, that warfare, raiding, and military command were exclusively male domains, with women relegated to domestic roles within an otherwise rigidly gendered social structure. The Birka discovery does not prove that female warriors were common. It proves that the categorical exclusion long assumed by historians was not absolute. At least one woman was buried with the full honors of a war commander, and the DNA leaves no room to explain that fact away. The broader 2020 study also traced the genetic footprint of Viking expansion with a precision that previous historical and archaeological methods could not achieve. Norwegian Vikings, the genetic data showed, were primarily responsible for voyages to Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, and Greenland, a westward expansion consistent with geography and historical accounts. Danish Vikings left their primary genetic mark in England and parts of continental Europe, contributing significantly to the population history of regions that would later become the Danelaw, the area of England under Norse legal and cultural influence for generations. Swedish Vikings moved east, into the Baltic states and along the river systems of what is today Russia and Ukraine, contributing significantly to the population history of those regions and to the founding, according to some historical traditions, of the early Russian state itself, through contact with Slavic populations along trade routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea and the markets of Constantinople. These were not 3 branches of a single coordinated movement. They were distinct populations, with distinct trade networks, distinct destinations, and distinct patterns of genetic exchange with the communities they encountered. Perhaps the most quietly devastating finding, for anyone invested in the idea of Viking racial purity, came from examining genetic diversity within individual Viking burial sites. Some graves identified by every archaeological marker as Scandinavian Viking burials contained individuals whose genetic ancestry traced substantially to southern Europe, people whose deep ancestry connected to populations around the Mediterranean, rather than the Nordic countries traditionally associated with Viking identity. How and why people of Southern European ancestry came to be buried with full Viking ceremonial honors in Scandinavian-style graves remains an open question, but the genetic fact is undeniable. The Viking world was absorbing and incorporating people from a genetic range far broader than the homogeneous Nordic warrior band of popular imagination. This matters for reasons that extend well beyond academic archaeology. In recent decades, Viking imagery has been deliberately appropriated by white nationalist and neo-Nazi movements across Europe and North America, who have constructed an entirely fictional narrative of Viking identity as a symbol of racial purity and ethnic homogeneity. Runic symbols, Norse mythology, and Viking iconography have been repurposed as markers of an imagined pure, white European heritage under threat. Tattoos, flags, and online symbols deployed by movements that have little genuine connection to the historical complexity of the culture they claim to honor. The 2020 genomics study, whatever its author's intentions, delivered a direct scientific refutation of this ideology. The Vikings were not racially pure. They were not even a single ethnic group. They were a remarkably diverse, mobile, and culturally permeable network of communities, bound together more by shared activity, trade, and cultural practice than by any coherent genetic identity. The DNA does not support the fantasy. It dismantles it piece by piece, grave by grave, genome by genome. There is a man buried in Orkney, more than 1,000 years ago, whose grave goods proclaim him a Viking warrior in every visible respect, and whose DNA proclaims him a son of the very land the Vikings supposedly conquered. There is a woman buried in Birka, with the full ceremonial trappings of a war commander, in a society popular history insists had no room for women in positions of military authority. There is a Scandinavian grave containing a person whose deepest ancestry traces to the shores of the Mediterranean, carried there by trade routes and personal journeys that no surviving saga thought to record. None of these individuals fit the story the modern world told itself about who the Vikings were. All of them are, by the only evidence that does not lie, exactly who the Vikings actually were. History is not written in books. It is written in genomes. And the Viking genome, when finally read with the precision modern science allows, tells a story not of racial purity but of radical permeability, 1,000 years of mixing, adopting, and becoming, in which identity was built far more by what people did and who they chose to be than by the blood they happened to inherit. The Vikings sailed into dozens of cultures and absorbed pieces of every one of them, and those cultures, in turn, absorbed pieces of the Vikings. The horned helmet was always a myth. It turns out the purity was too.